to do chapters 19 and 20 today. So if you would open up to, let me find it. You guys are probably already on it. My apologies. Chapter 19 starts on page 170. So if you'll join me there, and we can go ahead and start reading chapter 19. At lunchtime on Monday, George was sitting quietly in the school cafeteria, minding his own business. He got out his lunchbox and looked inside it, wishing he could have had a bag of chips or chocolate bars or orange soda like all the other kids. Instead, he had a spinach sandwich, hard-boiled egg, yet more broccoli muffins, and some apple juice pressed by his mother. He took a large bite of his sandwich and sighed. He wished his parents would understand that he wanted to save the planet as much as they did, but he wanted to do it in his own way. It was all very well for his parents to lead their alternative lifestyles because they only hung around with their friends, who were just like them. They didn't have to go to school every day with people like Ringo and his gang, laughing at them because they wore funny clothes and ate different food and didn't know what happened yesterday on the television. He tried to explain this to his dad, but all he heard back was, "We all have to do our part, George, if we're going to save the earth." George knew this was true. He just thought it was unfair and rather pointless that his part meant him being the laughingstock at school and not having a computer at home. He had tried to explain to his parents how useful a computer could be. "But, Dad," he had pointed out, "there's stuff you could do on a computer too, stuff that would help with your work. I mean, you could get lots of information from the internet and organize your marches with an email. I could set it all up for you and show you how." George had gazed hopefully at his dad. He thought he saw a spark of interest in his dad's eyes, but it flickered and died. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," his dad had said. "We're not getting a computer, and that's final." That, thought George as he tried to swallow his lump of spinach sandwich, was why he had liked Eric so much. Eric had listened to George's questions and given him honest replies, ones that made sense to George. George wondered if he dare stop by and see Eric later that afternoon. There was so much he wanted to ask him. And also, he really wanted Eric to check his talk for the competition. Just before lunch, he had finally summoned up the courage to sign up on the board for the science competition, the one with a computer as its first prize. Under topic, he had written, "My Amazing Rock from Outer Space." It looked great as a title, although George still wasn't sure that his talk was any good. He'd taken his lucky rock from outer space out of his pocket while he stood in front of the bulletin board, but to his horror, had found it was crumbling into dust. It was his lucky charm, the little piece of the solar system he had picked up near Saturn. The principal had been delighted to see George writing his name on the board. He had bounced up as George filled out the form. "There you go, George. That's the spirit. We'll show them, won't we?" He beamed at George. "We can't just let Manor Park walk away with every trophy in the area, can we now?" Manor Park was a private school that hogged all the prizes and won all the sports matches with boring regularity. "Yes, sir," said George, trying to stuff his outer space rock back into his pocket, but the sharp-eyed principal spotted it. "Oh, dear, a handful of dirt," he said, grabbing a nearby trash can. "Toss it in here, George. We can't have you going off to lunch with a pocket full of dust." When George just stood there, rooted to the spot, the principal rattled the can impatiently under his nose. "I was just the same as a boy," he said, a claim George doubted. As far as he was concerned, the principal had never been a boy. He was born wearing a suit and making enthusiastic comments about the under-12 football league. "Pockets full of nonsense. Drop it in and off you go." Reluctantly, George dropped the gray, crumbly remains of his most treasured possession into the can. He promised himself he would come back later and try to save it. As George munched his way through his sandwich, he thought about Eric and outer space and the competition the next day. While he was thinking, a hand crept over his shoulder and snatched a muffin out of his lunchbox. "Yum! This looks good," said Ringo's voice behind him. "George's famous muffins." Ringo took a large bite, then made a spluttering sound as he spat it out. George didn't need to look around to know that the whole dining room would be staring in his direction and snickering. "Ugh, that's gross," said Ringo, making fake gagging sounds behind him. "Let's see if the rest is just as horrible." His hand made another dive for George's lunch, but George had had enough. As Ringo's big paw rooted inside his handmade wooden box in which he kept his sandwiches, George slammed the lid down on his fingers. "Ow!" squealed Ringo. "Ow, ow, ow!" George opened the box again, allowing Ringo to pull out his hand. "What's all this noise?" said the teacher on the lunchroom duty, walking over. "Can't you boys manage to do anything without causing trouble?" "Sir, Dr. Reaper, sir," screeched Ringo, who was cradling his damaged hand. "I was just asking George what he had for lunch when he attacked me, sir." "You better give him double detention, sir, for the rest of the term. He's broken my hand, sir." Ringo smirked at Dr. Reaper, who gave him a very cool glance. "Very well, Richard," he said. "Go and see the school nurse and come to my room when she's looked at your hand. I'll deal with George." He ordered him away with the pointing of his finger, and Ringo slouched away, grinning to himself. The rest of the dining room had fallen silent while they waited for Dr. Reaper to announce George's punishment. But Dr. Reaper surprised them. Instead of giving George an earful, he sat down next to him on the long bench. "Go on," he waved a red hand at the rest of the room. "Get on with your lunches. The bell will ring soon enough, you know." After a couple of seconds, the usual hubbub started up again as everyone lost interest in George and went back to his or her conversations. "So, George," said Dr. Reaper chummily. "Yes, Dr. Reaper?" asked George nervously. "How are you?" Dr. Reaper sounded as though he really wanted to know. "Oh, fine," said George, somewhat taken aback. "How are things at home?" "They're, well, okay." I'm going to be a minute, sorry. I'm going to be a while. Said George cautiously, hoping Reaper wasn't going to ask him about Cosmos. "And how about your neighbor?" said Dr. Reaper, trying and failing to sound casual. "Have you seen him lately? Is he around at the moment? Or perhaps he has gone away?" George tried to figure out what answer Dr. Reaper wanted so he could give him the opposite one. "Perhaps people on the street are wondering where he's gone," went on Dr. Reaper, sounding spookier and spookier. "Maybe it seems that he has just disappeared, vanished from view. No idea where he might be. Is that it?" He peered hopefully at George, who was now convinced that there was something very wrong with Dr. Reaper. Almost as though Dr. Reaper sketched a shape in the air with his hands. He just flew off into outer space and never came back. What about that, George? Is that what happened, would you say?" The teacher was gazing at George, obviously wanting to hear that Eric had somehow melted away into thin air. "Actually," said George, "I saw him this morning." He hadn't, but it seemed very important to tell Dr. Reaper he had. "Drat!" muttered Dr. Reaper angrily, suddenly getting to his feet. "Miserable boys!" He walked out without even bothering to say goodbye. George closed up his lunchbox and decided to head back to the bulletin board so that he could look for his rock in the trash can. As he hurried down the corridor, he passed Dr. Reaper's office. He heard raised voices and stopped to listen through the door for a second. "I told you to deliver the note," rasped the familiar voice of Dr. Reaper. "We did," whined a boy's voice, which sounded all too like Ringo's. "You couldn't have," insisted Dr. Reaper. "You just couldn't have." George would have stayed to listen longer, but the bell rang, and he desperately wanted to find his special outer space rock before class began. However, when he got back to the can, it had been emptied. There was only a clean plastic liner inside it. Saturn's mini moon had gone. Chapter 20. It was pouring when George walked home that afternoon. Cold splats of water hurtled down from the dark gray sky as he trudged along. Cars dived through the big puddles at the edge of the road, sending tidal waves of dirty water swooshing over the pavement. By the time George reached his own street, he was shivering with cold. He got as far as Eric's door and hovered anxiously on the doorstep. He was longing to ring the bell and ask the scientist to help him with his talk for the next day. And he also wanted to find out what Dr. Reaper might think he had disappeared. But he was worried Eric might still be angry with him and send him away. To ring or not to ring? What to do? The skies were getting darker and darker, and suddenly he heard a huge clap of thunder. The rain got even heavier, and George made up his mind. It was important to ask Eric about his talk and tell him about Dr. Reaper. He decided to be brave and ring the bell. Bing bong! He waited for a few seconds and nothing happened. Just as he was wondering whether to ring again, the door flew open and Eric's head popped out. George, he said in delight, it's you. Come in. He reached out a long arm and whisked George inside, shutting the front door with a brisk slam. To his great surprise, George found himself standing in Eric's hallway, his wet coat dripping onto the bare floorboards. I'm so sorry, he stammered. What for? Said Eric, looking a little startled. What have you done? About Annie and the comet and Cosmos, George reminded him. Oh, that, said Eric. I'd forgotten all about it. But now that you mention it, don't worry. Annie told me that it was her idea, not yours, and that she made you go into outer space. I take it that's true? He looked at George under his heavy glasses, his bright eyes twinkling. Yes, actually it is, said George with relief. So really, continued Eric, I should be saying sorry to you for jumping to the wrong conclusion. Instead of considering all the evidence, I just applied some common sense, otherwise known as prejudice, and came up with a totally wrong answer. George didn't really understand all of this, so he just nodded. From the library, he could hear the sound of voices. Are you having a party? He asked. Well, yes, a kind of party, said Eric. It's a party of scientists, so we like to call it a conference. Why don't you come in and listen? You might be interested. We're talking about Mars. Annie's had to miss it, I'm afraid, as she's still at her granny's. You could tell her about it if you stay. Oh, yes, please, said George, forgetting in his excitement to ask about his talk or tell Eric about Dr. Reaper. As he took off his wet coat and followed Eric into the library, he could hear a woman's voice. This is the reason why my colleagues and I strongly advocate a thorough search of our closest neighbor. Who knows in the end what we may find by digging underneath the red surface? Eric and George tiptoed into the library. It looked quite different from the last time George had seen it. All the books were neatly arranged on shelves. Pictures of the universe hung on the wall in frames, and in the corner lay a pile of carefully folded spacesuits. In the middle of the room, on rows of chairs, sat a group of scientists who were all different shapes and sizes and looked like they had come from all over the world. Eric showed George to a seat, a finger pressed to his lips to show that George should keep very quiet. Standing at the front of the room was the speaker, a tall, beautiful woman with a braid of thick red hair so long it reached right down past her waist. Her green eyes glittered as she smiled at the scientists gathered for the conference just above her head. Cosmos's window portal was showing a red planet. The red-haired speaker continued her talk. Isn't it highly probable that evidence of life, had life existed on Mars in long ago times, is not there for us to find on the surface? We should never forget that every now and again, sandstorms radically alter a planet's surface, burying deeper and deeper beneath layers of inorganic dust the entire past of our red neighbor. As she spoke, they saw all through Cosmos's window an enormous sandstorm that took over the whole surface of the red planet. Eric bent his head towards George and whispered, "What she means is that even if there was once life on Mars, we wouldn't see it on the surface today. In fact, I can tell you, this scientist strongly believes that there was life on Mars at some stage. She sometimes even declares that there still is life there. That would be one of the most amazing discoveries of all time. But we can't say much more than that at this stage. We need to get onto this beautiful red planet ourselves to find out." George was about to ask why Mars was red, but realized that the speaker was finishing her talk. "Do you have any questions before we have a short break?" she asked her audience. "After that, we will discuss our last and most important issue." George felt very sad that he had only heard the end of the talk, so he raised his hand to ask something. Meanwhile, all the scientists were murmuring, "Ooh, snacks." None of them wanted to ask a question. "So let's have our well-deserved break then," said Eric, who hadn't spotted George's raised hand. The scientists ran over to the tea cart in the corner of the room, anxious to nab all the jelly donuts before the others could grab them. But the red-haired speaker had noticed George's thin arm waving in the air. Well, well, she said, looking at George. Colleagues, we do have a question after all, and it's from our new fellow down here. The other scientists turned and looked at George. When they saw how small he was, they all smiled and brought their coffee and pastry back to their seats. What would you like to know? Asked the speaker. Please, if you don't mind, said George, suddenly feeling very shy. He wondered if his question was a really stupid one and whether everyone would laugh at him. He took a deep breath. Why is Mars red? He asked. Good question, said one of the other scientists, blowing on his tea. George breathed a sigh of relief. Professor Kerskak, the red-haired speaker, whose name no one ever managed to pronounce, nodded and started to give George an answer. If you walk through the hills and mountains here on Earth, you can sometimes see red patches of ground that are not covered with any plants. This is true, for instance, in the Grand Canyon in the United States. But there are many other places where this is also the case. The ground is this color red because there is iron there that has rusted. When iron becomes oxidized, which is another way of saying it has rusted, it becomes red. It is because of the presence of oxidized iron, rusted iron, that the surface of Mars is red. Do you mean that Mars is made of iron? Asked George. Well, not quite. Since we sent some robots to Mars, we know that it's just a thin layer of rusted iron powder that gives Mars its red color. It seems that underneath the layer of red dust, the surface of Mars may be quite similar to the surface of the Earth, without the water, that is. So there is no water on Mars. There is, but the water we know of is not a liquid. On Mars, it's too hot during the day. Any water turns into vapor and is lost. So the only places where water can remain are those where the temperature always remains cold, day and night. So the water can freeze and remain frozen. This happens at the poles. At the North Pole of Mars, we have found large quantities of frozen water, ice. It's the same on Earth, where large ice reservoirs can be found at the poles, in the Arctic and Antarctic. Does that answer your question? And I'm not going to read the part on Mars right there, but when I'm finished reading, I would like you to go back to those two pages, 188 and 189, and read through about Mars. Yes, thank you, said George. He was just busy thinking up another question when Eric stood up at the front of the room, next to the speaker. Thank you, Professor Kerskak, he said, for your very interesting paper on Mars. Professor Kerskak bowed and went to take her seat. Dear friends and colleagues, continued Eric, before we move on to the last and most important issue we have to discuss, let me thank you all for making the effort to get here. Some of you have come from far across the globe, but I know the talks we have heard today have made the journey worthwhile. I'm sure I do not need to remind you how important it is that the existence of cosmos stay a closely guarded secret. The group nodded in its agreement. Now, continued Eric, the question we all came to answer is a question of fundamental interest for everyone who is involved in science. We all know far too well how it can be used for evil purposes, and that is why we have all taken the oath of the scientist, so that science can only be used for the good of humanity. But we are now facing a dilemma. As you heard in the news and saw on the Environmental March on Saturday, more and more people are concerned about the state of the Earth. So the question we now have to answer is, should we concentrate on finding ways to improve life on Earth and face its problems, or should we try to find another planet for humanity to inhabit? All the scientists in the room were silent and looked very serious. George watched them as they wrote an answer on a little piece of paper. Eric then collected the papers in a hat. In total, including Eric and the red-haired speaker, 8 scientists had voted. Eric then started to open up the papers one by one. The Earth, another planet, another planet, another planet. The Earth, another planet. Well, well, said Eric, it seems we have a split vote. The red-haired Professor Kerskak put up her hand. May I make a suggestion, she asked. Everyone else nodded. She got to her feet. George, she said, addressing the boy directly, we may lack a bit of perspective on the matter because we're all specialists in our fields. So, you could maybe tell us what you think about it. All the scientists were looking at him now. George felt very shy and stayed silent for a few seconds. Say what you really think, whispered Professor Kerskak. Twisting his fingers in his lap, George thought about his parents and the green campaigners. He then thought about the excitement of traveling in space and trying to find another home out there. And then he heard himself say to the scientists, why can't you do both? And that's the end of chapters 19 and 20. Thanks for hanging in there. I'll see you guys tomorrow.